Good evening and welcome back. Tonight, we are going somewhere most people think they already know. They know the ship. They know the iceberg. They know the ending. But knowing the ending of a story is not the same as knowing the story. Tonight, we are going to follow the Titanic, not as a disaster, not as a symbol, but as a world. A floating world, built by thousands of hands over the course of 2 years, populated by more than 2,000 people who each carried their own reasons for being there, their own hopes, their own ordinary plans for the days after they arrived. And we are going to follow that world, slowly, carefully, from the quiet dockyards of Belfast, through the calm waters of a spring crossing, and into the darkness of a night that most of them never expected would be their last. Before we begin, if you enjoy what we do here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It genuinely keeps this going. And wherever you are listening from tonight, whether it is late in London or past midnight on the other side of the world, drop your location and your local time in the comments. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that people in different cities, in different hours of the night, are settling into the same story at the same time. Now, get comfortable. Let the room go soft and dim around you. There is nothing you need to do for the next little while except follow along as we drift back to April of 1912, to a ship that left Southampton on a Wednesday morning, carrying the certainty of an entire age inside its steel hull, and to the sea that was waiting for it. Before there was a Titanic, there was a world that needed her. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the ship did not appear out of nowhere. She was the answer to a very specific question that the early 20th century was asking about itself. The question was this: how large can human ambition become before the world pushes back? The answer, as it turned out, was very large indeed. The year is 1907. The North Atlantic is the busiest stretch of water on Earth. Every week, dozens of ships cross it in both directions, carrying mail and cargo and the human traffic of a world in motion. Millions of Europeans are emigrating to America. American wealth is flowing back across the ocean in the form of tourists, businessmen, and the kind of first-class passengers who expect their ocean crossing to feel less like a voyage and more like a visit to a particularly well-appointed hotel. Two shipping companies dominate this trade: Cunard and White Star. They are rivals in the old-fashioned sense, not merely competitors, but antagonists, each watching the other with the careful attention of men who understand that prestige, once lost, is very difficult to recover. Cunard has just made a move. Their new ships, Lusitania and Mauretania, are the fastest ocean liners ever built. They cross the Atlantic in under 5 days. They win the Blue Riband, the informal prize for the fastest crossing, and they hold it with a confidence that makes the newspapers sit up and take notice. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of the White Star Line, watches all of this and makes a decision. He will not race Cunard. He will not try to build faster ships. Instead, he will build bigger ones, grander ones, ships so large and so comfortable that speed will seem beside the point, the way a fine hotel never advertises how quickly it can check you in. He takes this idea to William Peary, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipyard that has built White Star's ships for decades. The two men have dinner together at Peary's London home in the summer of 1907. Over the course of that evening, between the soup course and the dessert, they sketch the outline of a plan that will take 5 years to complete and change maritime history permanently. 3 ships, the largest ever built. The Olympic class. The first will be Olympic. The second, Titanic. The third, Britannic. Each will be roughly 882 feet long. Each will weigh over 46,000 tons. Each will carry more than 2,000 passengers and crew, and each will be designed not for speed, but for comfort, a floating world that happens to move. The decision is made. The dinner ends, and somewhere in Belfast, a shipyard begins clearing space for something that has never existed before. The Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast is not a beautiful place. It is enormous and purposeful and loud in the way that serious work tends to be loud. The sound of metal on metal, of rivet guns firing in rapid sequence, of cranes swinging massive sections of steel through the cold, damp air above the River Lagan. Building Titanic required the shipyard to build itself first. 2 enormous gantries were constructed, skeletal steel towers that rose above the yard like the frames of some unimaginable cathedral. Within those gantries, the ship would take shape piece by piece, steel plate by steel plate, rivet by rivet. And there were a great many rivets. Titanic's hull was held together by approximately 3 million of them. Each rivet was driven by hand. A team of 4 men, a boy to heat the rivet in a furnace, a holder-on to press it into place, and 2 riveters to drive it home with hammers. The work was relentless and dangerous and paid by the piece. The faster a team worked, the more they earned, and the more their arms ached at the end of the day. More than 15,000 men worked on Titanic at the height of her construction. Most of them were from Belfast, from the working-class neighborhoods that surrounded the yard. They rose before dawn. They walked or cycled to work in the dark. They spent their days in noise and cold and the particular smell of hot metal that clung to their clothes and their hair. They were shipbuilders by trade and by identity, and they were building the largest moving object that human beings had ever constructed. None of them expected to sail on her. The keel was laid in March of 1909. For the next 2 years, Titanic grew upward and outward inside her gantry. Her hull rose in sections. Her engines were installed, a combination of massive reciprocating steam engines and a low-pressure turbine, an arrangement designed for efficiency and reliability rather than raw speed. 29 boilers fed those engines, consuming several hundred tons of coal every single day at sea. Above the machinery, the ship became something else entirely. The first-class interiors were designed to resemble not a ship, but a hotel. A very good hotel, of the kind that wealthy Edwardians were accustomed to inhabiting on land. The dining saloon on D-deck was so large that it required 2 support pillars and seated over 500 people. The grand staircase, the one that has been reproduced in every film and illustration since, swept down through 5 decks, topped by a glass dome that let in the sky. The oak paneling, the carved balusters, the bronze cherub holding the lamp at the bottom of the handrail, all of it was crafted by artisans who spent weeks on work that most passengers would barely notice. There was a gymnasium with mechanical horses and rowing machines, a swimming bath filled with seawater, a squash court, Turkish bath, a Parisian cafe that operated every evening, complete with ivy trailing along its walls and the sound of a piano from somewhere nearby. Second class on Titanic was the equivalent of first class on most other ships of the period. The cabins were comfortable and private. The dining room served proper meals. There was a library. Third-class steerage was plainer. The accommodations were basic but clean, which was not always the case on competing vessels. For the emigrants who made up much of the steerage population, the journey was not about comfort. It was about arrival. They were heading toward something. The ship was only the means. Titanic was launched on May 31, 1911, into Belfast Lock. The event was attended by enormous crowds and very little ceremony. There was no champagne smashed against the hull. White Star did not go in for that kind of thing. The ship simply slid down the slipway, entered the water, and was brought alongside the dock for fitting out. The real work, it turned out, had barely begun. A ship is not a machine. A ship at sea is a society. Titanic carried 2,224 people when she departed Southampton on April 10, 1912. Each of those people had a reason for being there, a history, a set of expectations about what the next week would look like. Understanding the ship means understanding something about the world she contained. At the very top of that world was the first-class passenger list, a collection of names that read, in 1912, like a directory of Edwardian power. John Jacob Astor IV, the American real estate heir, was reputed to be one of the wealthiest men in the world. He was returning from a honeymoon in Egypt with his new wife Madeline, who was 18 years old and 5 months pregnant. Benjamin Guggenheim of the mining dynasty was aboard. Isidor Straus, co-owner of Macy's department store, traveled with his wife Ida. There was Molly Brown, Margaret Brown in the passenger manifest, a Colorado mining heiress who had clawed her way out of poverty and still had the energy and the bluntness to make most of the first-class passengers mildly uncomfortable. She would later become famous for her conduct on the night of the sinking. There was Lady Duff Gordon, the fashion designer, traveling with her husband under an assumed name, an eccentricity that would generate gossip for years. And there was Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, who was making this crossing partly to observe how his creation performed in actual service, and partly because he was a thorough man who did not believe in sending his work into the world without accompanying it. Second class contained a different kind of passenger: academics and clergy, engineers and skilled tradesmen, people who valued quality but were not interested in display. Among them was Lawrence Beasley, a science teacher at Dulwich College who was traveling to visit his brother in America. He survived the sinking and wrote one of the most careful and intelligent accounts of it ever produced. Third class, more than 700 passengers, was the most diverse group of all. Families from Ireland and Scandinavia and Eastern Europe. Single men heading to the coal mines of Pennsylvania or the stockyards of Chicago. A group of Lebanese immigrants from a village called Kafr Mishki. A Swedish family from outside Gothenburg. A young man from County Mayo named Eugene Daly who had brought his Uilleann pipes aboard, because where he was going he would want to remember where he had come from. The crew numbered approximately 885 people. Most of them were working-class men and women from the port cities of southern England, Southampton primarily, which supplied the bulk of the domestic staff. The stewards and stewardesses, the cooks and waiters, the bellboys and lift operators. They were professionals in service, people who understood their work as a craft. The deck officers were a different matter. Captain Edward Smith at their head. 5 senior officers below him. They were navigators and commanders, men who had served at sea for decades and who carried in their manner the particular confidence of people who have spent enough time on the ocean to have lost most of their fear of it. Among them was Charles Lightoller, the second officer. He was 40 years old in 1912, square-jawed and steady, a man who had survived a shipwreck in the Indian Ocean and a nearly fatal bout of malaria and who had worked as a cowboy in Alberta before returning to the sea. He would survive the Titanic as well, and his account of it, given at both the British and American inquiries, is among the most important documents of the disaster. And there was Frederick Fleet, a lookout, stationed in the crow's nest high on the foremast. He was 24 years old. He earned extra pay for lookout duty. On the night of April 14th, he would be the first person on the ship to see what was coming toward them. He rang the bell 3 times. He picked up the telephone to the bridge. But we are not there yet. Titanic left Southampton on the morning of April 10th, 1912, on a tide that suited her schedule. The departure was not without drama. As she moved away from the White Star dock, the suction of her enormous hull pulled 2 nearby ships from their moorings. One of them, the New York, swung toward Titanic and came within 4 feet of collision before tugs managed to push her aside. It was the first near miss of the voyage, and it delayed departure by about an hour. Most of the passengers who saw it assumed it was an interesting piece of seamanship. None of them took it as a warning. From Southampton, Titanic crossed the channel to Cherbourg, France, where she picked up additional passengers who had traveled overland from Paris and London. Tenders, small boats, ferried them out to the ship, since Cherbourg's harbor was too shallow for Titanic to enter directly. Among those who embarked at Cherbourg were many of her most famous first-class passengers, the Astors, Guggenheim, Molly Brown. Then to Queenstown on the southern coast of Ireland, the last port of call before the open Atlantic. Here, more passengers came aboard, and a small number of people disembarked. Among those who left the ship at Queenstown was a stoker named John Coffey, who had hidden himself in the mailbags to escape the ship. He was Irish and Queenstown was home. Whether he had a premonition or simply wanted to return, no one knows. He was the last person to voluntarily leave Titanic. By mid-afternoon on April 11th, the Irish coast had fallen away behind them, and there was nothing ahead but ocean. The first few days of the crossing were, by all accounts, uneventful in the best possible way. The weather was clear and cold. The sea was calm, unusually calm for the North Atlantic in April. Passengers settled into the routines of shipboard life. Meals were served on schedule in the dining saloons. The gymnasium was occupied through the morning. Card games ran long in the smoking room. Some people slept. Some people walked the deck and watched the sea and thought about where they were going. In the wireless room, the two Marconi operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, were busy. The ship's wireless was a commercial service as much as a navigation aid. Passengers paid to send telegrams. The operators handled an enormous volume of traffic, personal messages, business dispatches, news from shore. They also received ice warnings. The first came on April 12th from the French liner La Touraine, another on April 14th from the Caronia, several more throughout that day from the Californian, from the Mesaba, from Baltic. The warnings described ice fields and icebergs in Titanic's projected path. They were received, logged, and in some cases passed to the bridge. Captain Smith was aware of ice in the area. He did not change course. He did not significantly reduce speed. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, standard practice for the North Atlantic in 1912. Ice was a seasonal feature of these waters, not an emergency. Ships encountered it regularly and managed it by maintaining a lookout and relying on the standard assumption that icebergs, being large and dark, would be visible in time to avoid. The assumption depended on certain conditions. Moonlight helped. Rough water helped. The breaking waves at an iceberg's base created a telltale phosphorescence. A moderate temperature differential between air and sea created a slight haze around large objects. On the night of April 14, 1912, conditions were exceptional, but not in a helpful way. The sea was flat, absolutely flat, with no swell at all. The kind of glassy stillness that sailors sometimes call a dead calm. There was no moon. The sky was thick with stars. But starlight alone does not illuminate a dark object at sea. And the temperature had dropped sharply, well below freezing. In the crow's nest, Frederick Fleet and his fellow lookout Reginald Lee scanned the darkness ahead. They had been told to watch for ice. They had no binoculars. The glasses that were kept in a locker on the crow's nest had been lost somewhere between Belfast and Southampton, and replacements had never arrived. They watched with their eyes alone. The hours before the collision were quiet ones for most of the people aboard. By 11 o'clock, the great majority of the passengers had retired. The first-class smoking room still had a few men at the card tables. The dining saloons were empty. The corridors were dim and still. In their cabins, people were sleeping or reading, or lying in the particular suspension of thought that comes on the edge of sleep. They had no idea that the temperature outside had dropped to nearly 28 degrees Fahrenheit. They had no reason to notice. They were inside, warm, comfortable, in a world that had been designed to make them forget the ocean entirely. On the bridge, officers made their rounds. The night was clear and very cold. The stars were extraordinary, thick and brilliant in a way that only appears when there is no moon and no light from the land. The sea glittered faintly with them. At 11:39 p.m., Frederick Fleet saw something in the darkness ahead. It was darker than the sky. It had mass. It was close. He rang the bell 3 times, the standard warning for something directly ahead. He grabbed the telephone to the bridge. "Iceberg right ahead," he said. The officer of the watch, First Officer William Murdoch, gave the orders immediately. "Hard to starboard. Full astern." He gave the order to close the watertight doors. The ship began to turn. The engine slowed, then reversed. It was not enough. Titanic struck the iceberg on her starboard side, not head-on but at a glancing angle, a series of impacts that opened a series of thin gaps along nearly 300 feet of her hull, in the area below the waterline. The berg scraped and ground along the side of the ship and then slid away into the darkness behind her, disappearing almost immediately. It did not feel like the end of the world. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the collision. It was not a violent crash, not a dramatic impact that threw people from their beds or shattered windows. People felt a shudder, a vibration, a sound that some described as a grinding or a tearing, and others said they barely noticed at all. In the first-class smoking room, several men playing cards looked up, felt the vibration, exchanged glances, and returned to their hands. In third class, a few passengers opened their cabin doors and saw ice, small fragments of it, on the forward deck, where the collision had scattered splinters of the berg. Some of them picked up pieces to examine. One man built a small pile of ice on the deck as a souvenir. The ship was still moving. The lights were still on. The engines had stopped, but that was hardly alarming. Ships stopped their engines for all kinds of reasons. For perhaps 20 minutes, almost no one on Titanic understood what had happened. Thomas Andrews knew. He was called to the bridge shortly after the collision, and he went below with Captain Smith to inspect the damage. What he saw was the thing that his engineering calculations had never accounted for. Not 1 or 2 compartments flooded, but 5. The iceberg had opened the hull along an area so long that the ship could not survive it. The watertight compartments, which could save her if water was limited to 4, were simply not enough. He performed the calculation quickly, in the way that men who spend their lives with numbers perform them. He knew the rate of flooding. He knew the ship's buoyancy. He knew the arithmetic of what was coming. He told Captain Smith that the ship had between 1 and 2 hours. Smith received this information with the same steadiness that had characterized his entire career. Then he gave the order to call out the lifeboats. The problem that now confronted everyone on the ship was not mechanical. It was human, and it was layered with the assumptions and habits and social structures that had been built into the vessel from the very beginning. The first assumption that had to be overcome was disbelief. Titanic was sinking. She was doing so slowly and quietly, with no fire, no visible damage, no obvious sign of mortal injury to most of the people aboard. The lights were still on. The ship was still largely level. The stewards who knocked on cabin doors and asked passengers to come up to the boat deck met a range of responses from mild irritation to outright refusal. Some passengers dressed carefully, as though going to a social occasion. Others came up in their dressing gowns, assuming whatever was happening would be brief and that they would be back in their beds within the hour. A few refused to come up at all, insisting that the whole thing was unnecessary fuss. This was not stupidity. It was the rational response of people whose entire experience told them that Titanic would not sink. Modern ships did not sink. Large ships especially did not sink. The technology, the engineering, the safety features, all of it had been designed to prevent exactly this outcome. The idea that it was happening anyway was simply too large for some people to absorb quickly. The second assumption that had to be overcome was about the lifeboats. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Including collapsibles, they could hold approximately 1,178 people. There were 2,224 people on the ship. Even the boats that were available were not filled to capacity. The first ones lowered had empty seats. This was partly because passengers refused to board. Standing on a large warm ship in the cold night and being asked to climb into a small wooden boat and be lowered into a black ocean 60 feet below seemed, to many people, more dangerous than staying. And partly it was because the crew had received no training in lifeboat loading procedures, and no one was quite sure how many people could safely be lowered in a boat before the davits risked giving way. The boats went down half empty in the early stages. Later, when the ship's angle in the water made the reality undeniable, the boats were packed more fully. But by then, there were fewer places available. The band played. This is a fact so remarkable that it has become a kind of legend, and like most legends, it has accumulated details that cannot be fully verified. What is certain is that the musicians, 8 of them, gathered on the deck and played while the evacuation continued. They are reported to have played ragtime and popular songs and, near the end, hymns. They were not ordered to play. They chose to. None of them survived. The Titanic's list increased gradually through the early hours of April 15th. By 1:15 a.m., the bow was visibly lower. Water was visible on the forward well deck. The angle of the ship was now unmistakable to anyone who looked. The sound had changed as well. A constant backdrop of escaping steam from the funnels, of mechanical groaning, of things shifting in the interior. The wireless operators continued sending distress signals. The position they transmitted, 41 degrees 46 minutes north, 50 degrees 14 minutes west, would later prove to be slightly inaccurate, which complicated the rescue. But ships were responding. The Carpathia, commanded by Captain Arthur Rostron, had turned and was steaming toward the position at full speed. She was 58 miles away. She would not arrive in time. In the meantime, other ships were closer. The most heartbreaking case was that of the Californian, a cargo liner that had stopped for the night after being surrounded by ice, just 10 to 20 miles away from Titanic's actual position. The Californian's wireless operator had switched off his equipment and gone to bed shortly before the collision. Her officers saw the lights of what they thought might be a passenger ship, saw rockets being fired, and debated among themselves what it meant. They did not wake the wireless operator. They did not investigate more closely. They watched and waited, and the lights eventually disappeared. This part of the story, the Californian's watchkeeping officers watching what may well have been Titanic's rockets while the ship's 2,200 passengers faced death, has generated more argument and more anguish than almost any other aspect of the disaster. Back on Titanic, the situation became urgent and then desperate. The last lifeboats were loaded and lowered. Collapsible boats were freed from the roof of the officers' quarters. People in the water were crying out. The angle of the deck had steepened to the point where standing required holding on. Things that were not fastened, furniture, china, equipment, began to slide. The accounts that survive from those final hours come from people who watched from lifeboats, from the water, from the ship herself in her last minutes. They are fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, as eyewitness accounts always are when people are frightened and cold and the darkness is thick around them. What they agree on is this. In the final minutes before Titanic went under, the ship's stern rose out of the water. How high it rose, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, straight vertical, is debated, but it rose. And as it rose, the internal structure of the ship, which was designed to bear weight horizontally, not vertically, began to fail. There were sounds, described as roaring or cracking, or an enormous continuous tearing, as boilers broke free, as bulkheads gave way, as the forward funnel toppled into the sea. At some point in those final minutes, the time is uncertain, but estimates cluster around 2:17 to 2:20 a.m. The ship broke in two. The stern, now separated from the bow, rose higher briefly and then sank. The bow had already gone under. Titanic's bow struck the ocean floor first, at a depth of approximately 12,500 feet, traveling at a speed that drove it 60 feet into the mud. The stern arrived separately, more damaged, corkscrewing as it descended. On the surface, in water that was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to kill an unprotected person within 15 minutes. Approximately 1,500 people were in the sea. The lifeboats, most of them not full, were nearby. Most of them did not go back. The reasons given afterward, that returning risked being swamped by desperate swimmers, that the cries of people in the water made it impossible to distinguish one direction from another, were real considerations. But the mathematics are unavoidable. The lifeboats had room. The water was full of people. And the lifeboats, in most cases, waited at a distance until the sounds from the water faded into silence. One boat went back. Lifeboat 14, commanded by 5th Officer Harold Lowe, who had redistributed passengers between boats and then returned to the scene. He pulled 4 people alive from the water. He found many others already dead. The cries lasted approximately 20 minutes. And then silence. At 4:10 a.m. on April 15, 1912, the Carpathia arrived at the position transmitted by Titanic's wireless operators. She found lifeboats. She found survivors in those lifeboats, cold and shocked and wrapped in whatever they had managed to bring with them. She found debris, deck chairs, life preservers, fragments of wood, spread across an area of several square miles of ocean. She did not find Titanic. Captain Arthur Rostron had driven his ship through ice fields in the dark at full speed, a decision that was itself extremely dangerous, to reach the scene in the fastest time possible. He had prepared his ship for survivors. His medical staff was ready. His crew had blankets and hot drinks standing by. His passengers had been asked to give up their cabins. He brought 710 people aboard the Carpathia over the course of several hours. The count was exact: 710 survivors, out of 2,224 people. The Carpathia turned and headed for New York. The survivors sat in the ship's public rooms and on its decks, wrapped in blankets, drinking soup, trying to understand what had happened to them. Some of them could not speak. Some of them did not speak for days. Some of them, it was observed, seemed almost calm. A calm that experienced observers recognized not as composure but as shock, the body's way of refusing to process what the mind cannot yet accept. The Carpathia arrived in New York on the evening of April 18th, in darkness and rain, with enormous crowds gathered on the piers. Photographs taken that night show the survivors coming down the gangplanks. Their faces do not look like the faces of people who have been rescued. They look like people who have survived something they have not yet begun to understand. The statistics of survival are not random. Of the first-class passengers, approximately 62% survived. Of the second-class passengers, approximately 41%. Of the third-class passengers, approximately 24%. These numbers have generated decades of argument. They were shaped by several factors, some inevitable, some not. Geography played a role. First-class accommodations were higher in the ship and closer to the boat deck. Third-class passengers were deeper in the vessel and further from the lifeboats. The distance alone made a difference. Language played a role. Many third-class passengers did not speak English, and some accounts suggest that gates to upper decks were locked or guarded during the early stages of the evacuation. Though this is disputed, and some of the evidence is contradictory. Class played a role in more subtle ways as well. First-class passengers were accustomed to being attended to being guided, to having their needs anticipated. They responded quickly to instructions because they were accustomed to instructions being given for their benefit. Third-class passengers were accustomed to waiting, to following rules that were not always explained, to trusting that the systems around them would manage themselves. Gender mattered enormously. The code of women and children first was followed imperfectly. There were women who refused to leave their husbands, men who entered boats when there were still women waiting, but it was followed overall. Of the women aboard, approximately 74% survived. Of the men, approximately 20%. The gap between those numbers contains a great many individual stories. Isidor Straus refused to enter a lifeboat while any women remained on the ship. His wife Ida refused to leave him. They were last seen sitting together in deck chairs, holding hands. They were in their late 60s. They had been married 40 years. Benjamin Guggenheim, told that the situation was serious, went below decks with his valet and changed into his finest evening clothes. He reportedly told a steward, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He did. Arthur Puchin, a Toronto businessman and experienced amateur sailor, was asked by Second Officer Lightoller to climb down a rope into a lifeboat to help row it. Not an offer, but a necessity, since the boat lacked enough seamen. He spent the rest of his life defending himself against the implication that he had taken a place meant for others. The question of who had a right to survive followed many of the male survivors for the rest of their lives. J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director of White Star, entered a collapsible lifeboat when it was being loaded, and there appeared to be no more women or children nearby. He survived. The British and American press were not forgiving. The American newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst used the occasion to conduct a campaign of sustained personal attack on Ismay that bordered on the vicious. In the years following the disaster, Ismay withdrew from public life almost entirely. He retired to a remote estate in County Galway, where he lived quietly until his death in 1937. Before the survivors had fully recovered from the crossing aboard Carpathia, the investigations had begun. The American inquiry was convened by Senator William Alden Smith of Michigan, who had the advantage of being able to impound the ship's officers and crew before they could return to Britain. It began just days after the Carpathia arrived in New York. Smith was not an expert in maritime affairs, and his questions sometimes reflected that. There is a famous exchange in which he asked an officer whether the ship's watertight compartments had been sealed. The officer gently explained that yes, the compartments were watertight because they were, in fact, watertight, not because they had lids that could be closed. But Smith's inquiry gathered crucial testimony from survivors while events were fresh, and his instincts about what questions mattered were sounder than his critics allowed. The British inquiry, conducted by Lord Mersey, was more methodical and more technically rigorous. It went on for more than 30 days and heard testimony from nearly 100 witnesses. Both inquiries found that the ship had been traveling too fast for the conditions. Both found that the lifeboat provisions were inadequate. Both found that the Californians officers had failed to respond appropriately. Neither inquiry resulted in significant individual punishment. The White Star Line paid compensation to survivors and the families of those who died. The amounts were modest. The legal and moral questions raised by the disaster about class, about the duties of the powerful to the vulnerable, about the limits of human confidence in technology, were not so easily resolved. In the years following 1912, international maritime law changed significantly. Ships were required to carry enough lifeboats for all aboard. Regular lifeboat drills became mandatory. The International Ice Patrol was established, funded by 14 nations, to track and warn ships about icebergs in North Atlantic shipping lanes. It has operated continuously ever since. It operates today. For 73 years, Titanic lay undisturbed in the North Atlantic, 2.5 miles down, in the dark. She had been searched for. Various expeditions over the decades had attempted to locate her. None had succeeded. The ocean floor is not a flat and easily searched surface. It is immense and uneven and largely unexplored, and the wreck had landed some miles from the position that the wireless operators had transmitted. A small error in navigation that became a significant error in search. In September 1985, a joint American-French expedition led by oceanographer Robert Ballard found her. The discovery was made by an unmanned submersible, scanning the bottom in a systematic pattern. The images it returned were of a debris field first, the scattered contents of the ship, spread across a wide area by the sinking, and then, at the edge of the lights, a massive dark shape rising from the mud. The boiler, and then, beyond it, the bow. The photographs taken on subsequent dives became some of the most haunting images of the 20th century. The bow, largely intact, seated in the mud with its anchors still in place. The grand staircase gone, taken by the water long ago, but the opening it left intact, a void descending into the interior. The debris field, strewn with objects. A chamber pot, a child's shoe, china plates with the White Star logo still visible, a ship's telegraph. Ballard argued, and continued to argue for years, that Titanic should be left undisturbed. She is a grave site, he pointed out. More than 1,500 people died there. The wreck should be treated with the same respect afforded any other mass burial site. Others disagreed. In the years following the discovery, multiple expeditions recovered artifacts from the wreck, some for museum display, some for commercial auction. The legal battles over who owns the wreck and what may be done with it have never been fully resolved. The wreck itself is deteriorating. The combination of water pressure, ocean currents, and bacteria, organisms that literally consume iron, have been slowly dismantling the hull for decades. Some researchers estimate that within the next century, the bow and stern will collapse entirely into the sediment. The grand staircase opening will fall in. The funnels, long since gone, will leave no trace. Eventually, there will be only a stain in the ocean floor, an iron ghost in the mud. The Titanic did not simply sink. She entered the imagination of the 20th century and stayed there. There have been more books written about her than about almost any other single event of that century. More films, more documentaries, more academic papers. She has become one of those events, like the assassination at Sarajevo 2 years later, like the moon landing half a century after that accumulate meaning beyond anything their participants could have anticipated. Why this particular ship? Why this particular night? The answers are not simple, but they point towards something real. The Titanic disaster arrived at a precise historical moment, the end of the Edwardian period, the last summer of a particular kind of confidence before the world was shattered by the war that began 2 years later. She has become, over the decades, a symbol of that confidence and its limits, of the faith in technology and systems and human mastery over nature, of the gap between what people believe and what is true. She is also a story about class, about the different chances that human beings were given to survive based on where they happened to be born and how much money they carried. That story was uncomfortable in 1912 and remains uncomfortable now because the arithmetic has not changed as much as we might like to believe. She is a story about the sea, about the fact that beneath all human systems and certainties, the ocean exists on its own terms, indifferent to our plans, willing to wait. And she is a story about individual people, about Isidore and Ida Strauss holding hands in the dark, about the musicians choosing to keep playing, about Frederick Fleet seeing something in the darkness and reaching for the phone, about all the ordinary people in their cabins and their bunks who went to sleep on April 14th thinking about New York and woke to something they could not have imagined. More than 1,500 of them are still out there, in the dark water at the edge of what is now a debris field and was once a ship, in the place where the ocean kept what it took from that night and has not given back. There are stories from the Titanic that have never quite let go of the people who tell them. Harold Bride, the junior wireless operator, was washed off the ship as it went under. He climbed onto an overturned collapsible lifeboat and spent the night clinging to it in freezing water. He was pulled aboard the Carpathia with badly frostbitten feet, wrapped in blankets, and immediately brought to the wireless room, because the Carpathia's own operator had collapsed from exhaustion and worked the wireless until they reached New York. His account of the night, given to a newspaper shortly after arrival, remains one of the most vivid documents of the disaster. Violet Jessup, a stewardess, had also been aboard the Olympic when it collided with a Royal Navy cruiser the previous year. She survived the Titanic. She would later survive the sinking of Britannic, the third of the Olympic-class ships, when it was used as a hospital ship during the First World War and struck a mine. She kept going back to sea. She died in 1971, at the age of 83, in a cottage in England. Charles Juffin, the chief baker, reportedly drank a substantial quantity of whiskey on the night of the sinking and then spent considerable time throwing deck chairs into the sea for use as flotation devices. He is said to have stepped off the stern as it rose into the water and to have remained in the ocean for approximately 2 hours before being pulled into a lifeboat, longer than almost any other survivor who was actually in the water. Whether the alcohol genuinely helped him sustain his body temperature, or whether this is one of the many stories that the Titanic has accumulated and embellished in the retelling, is impossible to determine now. Eva Hart was 7 years old when she sailed on Titanic. Her mother refused to sleep during the crossing because she did not trust the ship. Eva's father put them both into Lifeboat 14, Harold Lowe's boat, the one that went back, and returned to the ship. Eva spent her entire life campaigning against the commemoration of the Titanic as a romantic tragedy. She found nothing romantic in it. She had seen what it was. She died in 1996, 84 years after the night in question, still telling people what she had seen from the lifeboat. There is a question that every telling of the Titanic story eventually reaches, and it is not a historical question. It is a human one. What do we do with the knowledge that the systems we trust can fail? The Edwardian world that built Titanic believed, sincerely, not naively, that human ingenuity was capable of mastering the conditions of the physical world. Not to eliminate risk exactly, but to manage it, to contain it, to reduce it to acceptable levels. The engineering was sound. The calculations were correct as far as they went. The ship was as safe as anything that had been built before. And then the conditions that the calculations had not anticipated arrived together on a single night. A dead calm that removed the visual warning of breaking water, a starlit darkness that was too dim for unassisted eyes, an iceberg that sat low in the water, a closing speed that gave a lookout without binoculars 20 seconds to respond. The systems held right up until they didn't. This is not a comfortable lesson. It does not resolve into a simple moral about hubris or the limits of technology. The people who built and sailed Titanic were not arrogant fools. They were careful, experienced professionals doing work they understood well, in conditions that were familiar and manageable in virtually every other instance. The disaster does not tell us that technology cannot be trusted, or that the ocean cannot be crossed, or that confidence is always its own punishment. Ships cross the Atlantic every day. They have been doing so for more than a century since April 14, 1912, in greater safety than ever before, partly because of what was learned that night. What the Titanic tells us, perhaps, is something more modest and more lasting. That the distance between the world as we understand it and the world as it actually is remains, always slightly larger than we think. That the gap between a plan and an outcome can be opened by small things. A missing pair of binoculars, a calm sea, a moonless sky. That the human tendency to trust what has worked before is both our greatest strength and our most persistent vulnerability. Frederick Fleet, the lookout who first saw the iceberg, was asked at the American Inquiry whether, if he had had binoculars, he might have seen it sooner. He said, "We could have seen it a bit sooner." "How much sooner?" the senator asked. "Enough to get out of the way," Fleet said. He lived until 1965. He spent most of those years in relative obscurity. He sold newspapers on the streets of Southampton. He was not famous and did not seek to be. He had simply been the man in the crow's nest on the night in question, the first one to see what was coming. And then it came anyway. Are you still with me? If you have drifted most of the way to sleep by now, that is exactly where you should be. There is another quiet voyage waiting for you on the screen whenever you are ready. Another world to drift through in the dark. If tonight's journey stayed with you, a like or a subscribe means more than you might think. It helps other restless minds find their way here, to this quiet corner of the night where history waits at the end of the day. But not tonight. Tonight, let the story settle into the silence. Let the cold water and the stars and the sound of the band playing recede into the distance, the way sound does when you are falling asleep. The ship has gone where it went. The survivors have told their stories. The sea is quiet now. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the night press gently down. Close your eyes. Sleep well, and sweet dreams.